Hello there, my name is Ryan and this is lesson 10 of working with JavaScript. In this lesson we'll be learning all about for loops. So once again we link to our external script file and we have a div tag to do some output. In my external JavaScript I have my anonymous function and then I can begin my loop. So what is a loop? A loop is basically something that repeats over and over again. But at some point it needs to stop repeating, otherwise we'll end up getting something called an infinite loop, which uses all our memory up and we eventually crash the machine. So let's look at some of the things the loop needs to have in order to be classified as a loop. It must have an initial value, starting value. It must have some kind of a test. And it must have some kind of modifier where the value is changing. So let's start with a basic loop, basic for loop. We declare the variable and initialize it to a value. We do our test and we do our modifier, which is changing the value of the variable. And then in our block I'm just going to output the value of x as well as a break so that we can go on to the next line. I'm going to also do a plus equals so we concatenate to the value of the div. So there you can see it has numbered from 1 to 10 inside the div. So this is pretty awesome stuff. It repeats whatever's between the curly brackets a certain number of times. In this case that will be repeated 10 times. So how does it work? Well, the initializer, in this case x is equal to 1, will only ever take place once. Whereas these two steps, the test and the modifier, here's the test, here's the modifier, will take place every time. So we start with x at a value of 1 and then we ask the question, is 1 smaller than or equal to 10? That will either be true or false. In this case 1 is smaller than 10, so it's true. And if the test is true, we may enter the curly brackets and perform whatever steps are in between the curly brackets. So because we passed the test, we then print the value of x to the panel, to the block. In this case x is a 1 followed by a break. So that will give us the first step. The next thing that happens is our modifier. Modifier means you're changing the value of your variable. In this case we are increasing the value of the variable by 1, x plus plus. So x becomes 2 and then we ask the question again, is 2 smaller than or equal to 10? True or false? In this case it's true. So we may enter the curly brackets for a second time and then we display the value of x, which is 2 followed by a break. So now we've done the first two steps. And this pattern repeats itself until the test becomes false. So in the last case we've now displayed the value of 10 followed by a br and we increase the value of x by 1, so x becomes 11. So then we're saying, is 11 smaller than or equal to 10? True or false? In this case it's true. So then we display the value of x. In this case it's false. 11 is not smaller than 10. So because it's false it may not enter the curly brackets. So it just finishes at 10. We obviously can make it go up to whatever value we want. So we could go up to 8 for example. If we had a less than 8 instead of a less than or equal to 8, it would only go up to 7. What would happen if we said x is greater than 8? Well, in this case it would never run because we're saying x must start off at 1 and then we ask the question, is 1 greater than 8? It's not, it's false. So it will never ever enter the curly brackets. So this would be a silly example. This is a case where a loop does not run. Another bad case would be if we used x greater than 0 as our test. Because think about what's going to happen here. X is going to start off at 1. Is 1 larger than 0? Yes, it is. So it enters the curly brackets and displays that to the screen. Is 2 larger than 0? Yes, it enters the curly brackets. Is 1,000,000 larger than 0? Yes, it is. So we sit here with what we call an infinite loop. When you run this, it actually gets stuck. The browser just carries on forever and ever and ever. So you've got to actually press the stop button as quick as you can, because if you leave it running too long, you'll use up all your memory of your machine and it will actually not be able to cope. You'll see now it's still battling to stop my script, even though I've pressed the stop button. The longer it runs, the worse it gets exponentially. So don't get yourself into a situation where you have an infinite loop. Okay, you see I've got a message now. The browser's telling me the page is unresponsive. I can either kill it or I can wait for it to finish. I'm going to kill it. Otherwise, it's simply going to run on forever. So that's just the safety mechanism the browser puts in place. Otherwise, it's just going to run out of memory. So make sure that your test will fail at least at some point in time. So you must always be able to pass the test, and you must fail the test at some point in time. So we'd need to rather say x is less than or equal to 10 or something that's attainable. Let's run it again. This time it should actually come to a natural end. So there's a fine balance between the three steps, between the initial value, between the test, and between the modifier. How would you make this increase by 2 instead of by 1? In other words, we want all the odd numbers, for example. So all we do is we change the modifier. We say x equals x plus 2. So we increase x by 2. So now we should land up with all the odd numbers instead of every single number. This can also be abbreviated to x plus equal to 2 if we wanted to. My browser is a little bit slow now after using up all that memory earlier on, but it should finish at some point in time. Okay. I see what I've done wrong here. I created an infinite loop. I should have said x equal to x plus 2. Let's try this again. That's much better. Alright, so we have now all the odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, each time increasing by 2. How would we get all the even numbers? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Well, our starting value would have to change to either a 0 or a 2. We're still going to increase by 2. The only difference is we're starting at a different value. And then we have all the even numbers. Okay, how would we go backwards from 10 all the way down to 1? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Well, obviously our starting value, or our initialize, would start at 10. But now we would have to change the test. We'd have to swap it around. We'd have to say greater than 0, or else greater than or equal to 1. And then we'd have to say x minus minus to decrease the value of x by 1 each time. So there we have 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 all the way down to 1. Okay, we can also use a for loop within a for loop. For example, let's say we wanted to draw a square using stars. We could, in other words, I want to create a shape something like this, where we have 4 stars per line, 4 by 4 square. Okay, to do something like this, let's start with the first row. We could say cols is equal to 1, cols is less than or equal to 4 because we want a total of 4 columns, and then we could increase the value of cols by 1. And then instead of displaying X, we would display just a star. So there we have 4 stars next to each other. The temptation would be to actually assign this to be a star and then increase that, but you can't do that because a star plus 1, you can't add 1 to a star, it's impossible. These need to always be numeric in nature. Okay, so I've done 1 row of the square. I need to now do another 3 rows. So I need to repeat this. I need to also add a BR. So I'm gonna add a plus equals followed by a BR. You won't see this obviously, but it will appear at the end of the line. So I need to repeat this entire thing another 3 times. So I could do that in one of 2 ways. I could do it using 1 for loop or using 2 for loops. I'm going to do it using 2 for loops. So I'm going to create another for loop. I'm going to assign this to 1. And then I'm going to increase the value of rows by 1. Alright, let's see what happens. So what I'm getting now is I'm getting 16 stars. So my problem is, where is the BR? The BR is not coming in the right place. So what we're going to do is we're going to move this and paste it over there. And there we have our square. So this is a for loop within a for loop. It's actually running a total of 16 times. The outer for loop is handling the rows, and the inner for loop is handling the columns. So what happens is it enters the outer loop for the first time. Rows becomes 1. And we ask the question, is 1 smaller than 4? Yes, it is, so we can enter the outer for loop. So we enter the curly brackets, these curly brackets. Then the inner loop starts. So now another variable is initialized. Cols becomes 1. And we say, is 1 smaller than 4? Yes, it is. So then we display 1 star on the screen. What happens next? We increase the value of columns. So cols becomes 2. Is 2 smaller than 4? Yes, it is. So we enter and print another star, and print another star, and print another star, until we've printed 4 stars. Because then when it gets to 5, this will be false, and it will no longer enter the curly brackets. So then it will come down here and print a break after the first row of the square. Then what will happen is I will increase the value of rows, because remember I'm still inside of the outer loop. So rows will increase by 1, rows will become 2, and then it will carry on with the second row of the square. This inner for loop will begin again from the beginning, because it's now fresh again. And so it will go from 1 to 4, each time displaying 1 star. Now this whole thing could be written with 1 for loop. Much more elegant solution. So we could say var x is equal to 1, x is less than or equal to 16, because there's 16 stars in total, and we could increase the value of x by 1. And then we could display a star to our panel. So I'm just going to remove our first for loops for now, just to show you what happens. So now we'll end up with 16 stars all in a row. The problem is I need to place the BR after every 4th star. So hopefully you can remember back to where we spoke about the modulus operator. So we would say if x modulus 4 is equal to 0, In other words, if we take the value of x and divide it by 4, if the remainder is 0, in other words, if it goes in exactly, in other words, if it's a multiple of 4, then add a BR. So after every fourth star, 4, 8, 12, 16, it will add a BR. And there we have our square. So this is a much more elegant solution using only one for loop and using the modulus operator. This formula is testing for multiples of 4. If it's true, it will print a break. Remember, we don't want to print a break after every star, only after every fourth star. And this ends our lesson in working with for loops.